Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. Today, a continuation of the Cornwall research, which will eventually be gathered together into a gazetteer. This month's chapter, The Lost Cities. When researching a new work, you collect bits of trivia until eventually they click into a structure. I think this chapter is the one which draws Hunt's work together for role-players. I can't detail it here, much more research is required, but in this chapter we see Lioness, and for us, Lioness is the low-hanging fruit that makes the rest of this material simple to use and to integrate into mythic Europe. Time for a quote from Hunt. A region of extreme fertility, we are told, once linked the Scilly Islands with western Cornwall. A people known as the Silures inhabited this tract, which has been called Lioness, or sometimes Letherso, who were remarkable for their industry and piety. No less than 140 churches stood over that region, which is now a waste of waters, and the rocks called the Seven Stones are said to mark the place of a large city. Even tradition is silent on the character of this great cataclysm. So to move on from Hunt, the Saxon Chronicle says that Lioness was inundated on the 11th of November, 1099. Another chronicle, written slightly after the game period, says that it was on the 9th of November. That's well within 2 Hermetic generations. It might explain why there's no covenant in Cornwall, despite it being an interesting site, once it's been detailed to make it so. The covenant at this end of Great Britain was on the main part of Lioness and has vanished. Latin writers call this land either entire or merely the largest island Siluria. It is a perfect covenant name. Strabo says that Siluria was divided from the rest of Britain by a narrow channel with fierce currents. It's accompanied by 9 smaller islands which his people seek for trade. They call these the Tin Islands, the Cassiterides. William of Worcester, who died around 1482, recorded that the land was from the eastern shore of Mounts Bay to the northwestern rock of Scilly, with the exception of a narrow strait between Longships and Land's End. A note on names: there's no good etymology for Lioness. The Cornish name may be Letherso, or that may be like the English Seven Stones, a reference merely to the remnant rocks of Scilly. The Cornish name for the places within these stones is Tregva, which means dwelling, and it's said to be the site of the major city that was lost when Siluria was inundated. Moving on, the Grey Rock in the Wood. St. Michael's Mount used to be a hill surrounded by a forest, which was later developed, at least partially, into croplands and meadows. Its name in Cornish is still Carrick Lus and Cus. I apologise to any Cornish people listening, which Hunt says means the White Rock in the Wood. More modern sources seem to say Grey Rock in the Wood. The land used to extend 6 miles south of the Mont to a line from Clement's Isle to Cudden Rock, according to Hunt. For modern players, that's from Mousehole to Cudden Point. Cudden Point's interesting to us because there's a lost treasure there sought by children at extreme low tides. Sometimes they even find some, although that may just be fairies starting their games. Time for some more Hunt. Amongst other things, an special search is made for a silver table, which was lost by a very wealthy lord, by some said to be the old Lord Pengerswick, who enriched himself by grinding down the poor. On one occasion, when the calmness of summer, the clearness of the skies, and the tranquillity of the waters invited the luxurious to the enjoyments of the sea, this magnate, with a party of gay and thoughtless friends, was floating in a beautiful boat lazily with the tide, and feasting from numerous luxuries spread on a silver table. Suddenly, no one lived to tell the cause, the boat sank in the calm, transparent waters, and long after the event the fishermen would tell of sounds of revelry heard from beneath the waters, and some have said they've seen these wicked ones still seated around the silver table. The quote from Hunt ends there. This may be an infernal aura or regio. Hunt notes that the main anchorage in Mount Bay is called Guavas Lake. Folkloristically, it was a lake, but the sea has eaten into the land so far that it's now aggregated into the ocean. There is a forest of beech trees visible under the water, which sweeps to the mount. Beech nuts can be collected on the shore after rough tides, and at neap tides visitors may cut wood from the beech trees. In the real world, there is a remnant forest under the bay, which has been investigated by archaeological digs. The beech nuts may be a vis source. Moving on to the city of Langarrow, or Langona. Again, time for a lengthy quote from Hunt. "We cannot say how many years since, but there once stood on the northern shores of Cornwall, extending over all that country between the Canal and the Perrin Porth, a large city called Langarrow, or Langona. The sand hills which now extend over this part of the coast cover that great city, and the memory of the sad and sudden catastrophes still lingers among the peasantry. So settled is tradition that no other time than 900 years since is ever mentioned as the period at which Langarrow was buried." To break from Hunt's quote just briefly, Hunt was writing in 1908. Well, at least the edition of the book I'm using is from 1908. So that would mean 1008 if taken literally, possibly a few years earlier for an earlier edition of the book. Back to Hunt. "This city in its prime is said to have been the largest in England, and to have had 7 churches, which were alike remarkable for their beauty and their size. The inhabitants were wealthy, and according to received accounts, they drew their wealth from a large tract of level land, thickly wooded in some parts and highly cultivated in others, from the sea, which was overflowing with fish of all kinds, and from mines, which yielded them an abundance of tin and lead. To this remote city in those days criminals were transported from other parts of Britain. They were made to work in the mines, on the coast, in constructing a new harbour on the Canal, and clearing it of sand, so that ships of large burden could in those days sail far inland. Numerous curious excavations in the rocks on either side of this estuary are still pointed out as being evidences of the work of the convicts. This portion of the population of Langarrow were not allowed to dwell within the city. The convicts and their families had to construct huts or dig caves on the wild moors of this unsheltered northern shore, and to this day evidences of their existence are found under the sand in heaps of wood ashes, amidst which are discovered considerable quantities of mussel and cockle shells, which we may suppose was their principal food. For a long period this city flourished in its prime, and its inhabitants were in their enjoyment of every luxury which industry could obtain or wealth could purchase. Sin, in many of its worst forms, was, however, present amongst the people. The convicts sent to Langarrow were of the vilest. They were long kept widely separated, but use breeds familiarity, and gradually the more designing of the convicts persuaded their masters to employ them within the city. The result of this was, after a few years, an amalgamation of the two classes of population. The daughters of Langarrow were married to the criminals, and thus crime became the familiar spirit of the place. The progress of this may have been slow. The result was, however, sure, and eventually, when vice was dominant and the whole population sunk in sensual pleasures, the anger of the Lord fell upon them. A storm of unusual violence rose and continued blowing without intermitting its violence for one moment for 3 days and nights. In that period the hills of blown sand, extending with few intervals from Cranstock to Perrin, were formed, burying the city, its churches, and its inhabitants in a common grave. To the present time those sandhills stand as a monument to God's wrath, and in several places we certainly find considerable quantities of bleached human bones, which are so many strong evidence of the correctness of tradition. Cranstock was, according to tradition, once a trading town, and it had then a religious house with a dean and 9 prebends. The Canal, filling up, ruined the town. This must have happened when Langarrow was destroyed. On Guithian sands, the remains of what is supposed to have been a church has been discovered, and according to Halls and Gilbert, a similar tradition exists here of a buried town. And time to step away from that quote from Hunt for brief notes on other lost territories. Many other areas are marked as being stolen by the sea in local law. Hunt records the tradition that from Bram Head to the two Loos were 2 fertile valleys, stated to have extended at least a league southwards over a tract now covered with sea. On a smaller level, the Black Rock in Falmouth Harbour used to be a tidal island. 2 towns, Lelant and Pillicum, near Hale, were both covered in a single night. Lelant was the mother church of St. Ives, which argued it once had a substantial population. The land around the Chapel Rock at Perrin Porth has been washed away, but the Lord still allows pilgrimages there to continue. It's possible to walk dryfoot to the island at 11 o'clock each day, despite the sea clearly being in the way. It's a mystery or a divine regio if you're a magus. Before I called Lioness low-hanging fruit, but it's low-hanging fruit that will take some time to ripen. I need to do some more research to pull all of that material together. Let's take the low-hanging fruit from this chapter and have a look for some story hooks. There is a myth encoded in the coat of arms of the Trevelyan family of Cornwall. The coat of arms is gules, a horse argent from a less wavy argent and azure, issuing out of the sea proper. That is, it's a silver horse coming out of the ocean. Their ancestor fled the encroaching floodwaters on his horse, landing on the Cornish coast. That makes that family one point of inquiry into the nature of the disaster. Hunt works through a digression in this chapter on the Padstow hobby horse, which locals ride into the sea each year. He suggests it's linked to the Padstow mermaid, which we covered in a different chapter, or the horse that brought someone safely from Lioness. He also suggests that minor sayings such as "there's a horse in the load," meaning a valueless stone, in the middle of the tin ore, or "Blackjack rides a good horse," that tin ore often indicates the presence of copper ore, may be related to the Padstow hobby horse. Then he tries to rope in the water horse myth in the vaguest of ways, and these are weak links, but that's fine for gaming. The riding of the horse into the sea may be a way of stopping more land from being taken by a fairy power. Far later, Hunt notes that the sister of a vicar received a vision in which she was told to prepare a certain potion and pour it into the waters so that the land would rise and the people be reanimated from an unaging magical sleep. Her technique or faith failed her, and the land did not rise. Maybe the Magi might arrange the ritual better. Might there be a covenant in this unaging sleep? Lioness is the home of Tristram of the Round Table. There's a heap of material there, which we'll need to circle back to. We'll mine it when we reach the chapter on Arthur in later weeks. Is the fall of Lioness where the Selkies and the Merryfolk come from? Are they perhaps not a fairy race, but a group of transformed humans? Might it be possible to live among them? Could a whole kingdom still be there, walled off in Arcadia or just behind simple magic? Near Tregva, Cornish fishermen often catch artifacts in their nets. The oddest mentioned in Hunt are windows. He's unclear, but if he means glass windows, then that argues for supernatural manufacture. Flat glass windows are not known in period. Flag this as a contested vis source, at least. Why aren't people more worried about the loss of Lioness? 140 parishes isn't a small country. That's about the quarter of the population of Kent, which is the largest county in England in 1220. The loss of a city, and therefore a bishop, seems to have slipped the mind of mythic Europeans in a most distressing way. Is this the order tidying up after they sank the whole place during the schism? Is this God or the fairies? Does this forgetting make it difficult to research or even remember the folklore of Lioness? St. Michael appeared on the rock in 495. People make pilgrimages to the Quai de Miguel, a stone seat he left there, that is difficult to reach. Sitting on the chair is the traditional end to the pilgrimage to the mount. When St. Cana visited the mount, she sat on the chair and gave it the same power as her well, which is that whenever one of a set of newlyweds uses it first, they will have the power in the marriage. The forest of trees under Mount Bay is in the real world just a remnant, but in mythic Europe, particularly at certain times, might it not be a full and verdant woodland? Who or what might dwell therein? Langarrow might have been destroyed by the Lord, but it is undated suspiciously slightly before the formal declaration of the renunciation of Daedni, in an area where the Druids were presumably strong. This dating assumes that exactly 900 years have passed, but a slight rounding in folklore places this event during the active phase of the Schism War. Next week, for the 75th episode of Games from Folktales, the longest episode ever, The Adventures of Captain Shard. A short story, a very long story, and then a brief tale, all by Lord Dunsany, about a pirate captain who does some very unlikely things, thereby setting up a covenant, having a great adventure, and perhaps inspiring a fairy.